Good morning, ladies. Our devotion this morning comes from James chapter 2, verses 14 through 26. So if you would like to turn in your own Bible to read along as I read it, um, I, I would welcome you to do that. This is the passage where it talks about faith without works is dead, and sometimes this is one of the key passages or a prime example of looking at things in context. We are saved by faith. There is nothing that we can do, no matter how good a person I am. There is nothing that I can do that makes me worthy of salvation and worthy of a relationship with God. And so James is not contradicting what Paul says in Ephesians, where it says you are saved by faith alone in Ephesians 2:9. Paul was dealing with the problem of legalism and some people that were criticizing others for the way that they were living, and saying you're not really a Christian because you're not living, you're not doing this, not doing that. So Paul was dealing with a different issue, and that salvation, he was having to remind people that salvation was through faith only. James was concerned with believers who had maybe had an immature faith, devoid of good works. They were the other extreme. I am saved by faith, so I don't have to worry about any of these rules and regulations that we have to deal with. So let's read the passage. James chapter 2, verses 14 through 26. What does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith, but does not have works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, depart in peace, be warmed and filled, but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? Thus also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith, and I have works. Show me your faith without works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that there is one God? You do well. Even the demons believe and tremble. But do you want to know, O foolish man, that faith without works is dead? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? Do you see that faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect? And the scripture was fulfilled which says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. You see then that man is justified by works and not by faith only. Likewise, was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way? For as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also. So when we look at this passage, it's very evident that works will be the evidence to others that we know God, that we have faith in God. Whenever I read a passage in the New Testament, it's really important, and they reference Old Testament examples. It's interesting. It's important. I believe it's important, but it's also fun and interesting to go back and read the account and look at the whole picture, the whole story. And what it's talking about with Abraham here is when God tested Abraham's faith. God had promised Abraham his descendants would be as numerous as the sands of the earth, that no one would be able to count them, that he would be made a great nation. And it was promised through Isaac, his son through Sarah. And God had promised that. And now God is asking Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. And when you go back and look at the account, which is in Genesis chapter 22, when you read it, Abraham does what God commands him, and then God, the angel of the Lord, stops him and says, and points out, your faith is great, and he provided the sacrifice to save Isaac. God was testing Abraham, and he came through that test. Um, so when we look at that, we see it was about obedience. It was about, do you really trust me? Um, when our oldest son was little, he was kind of a little daredevil, and he was just all boy, rough and tumble. But we have one of my favorite pictures of him when he was about 4 or 5 years old. And it's a picture of him. At the time, we had a Ford Bronco, which is kind of a tall SUV car. And he would stand on the top of that, and my husband would say, okay, jump. And he would just leap like a swan dive to my husband's arms because he knew my husband was going to catch him. And that is an example of what God was doing with Abraham here. He was saying, jump. And Abraham basically said, how high? Okay. And God honored that faithfulness and kept his promise. Um, Sometimes when we look at an Old Testament example, we think, well, that was the Old Testament. He was under the law. Jesus came to fulfill the law. He didn't come to abolish the law, but he came to fulfill the law. And because now we are not a slave to all the sacrifices that have to be made because Jesus was the sacrifice for our sin, then it's not the same. But when you look at what Jesus said about keeping his commandments, you need to look at the whole context of that. And when we look at John chapter 15, where Jesus is talking about he is the vine, it starts with, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. And it says, every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that bears fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. So God is watching what we're doing and how we're handling ourselves. Um, Jesus says that if you are in me, you will be bearing fruit. If you're dependent on Christ, you're going to bear fruit. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Those are all things that are really actions. Even love, sometimes we consider love as just a feeling. Love is not a feeling, love is an action. We do things out of love. We act on that. So we will be showing that we are followers of Christ, that we are saved by faith because we are showing the fruits of the Spirit. And if you read down a little further, getting into the passage of John chapter 15, verses 9 through 17, down in there, let's see, in verse 9, starting in verse 9, it says, as the Father loved me, I also have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. So Jesus is telling us right there that we are going to have works. I'm sorry. I have clocks, so they're starting to go off. I am not going to stop because I want to finish this. So, Jesus is telling us that if we love him, we will keep his commandments. And then in verse 12, he says, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. And so we are saved by faith alone. It is only Jesus' death on the cross that is payment for my sin, and his resurrection from the dead that gives us victory over sin and over death. We are saved by that. But if I really believe what I say I believe, it will be evident in my life. I will be doing good works. I will be checking on my neighbors. I will be making sure that if I have done something to offend someone, I go to them and apologize um, with humility. Those are the things that are going to show. We're going to have works that are going to come out of that love for Christ, and that'll be evident in our lives. So I pray that you can ponder this and meditate on this and search for yourself, search the scriptures for yourself, and that you will have a wonderful afternoon.